Hi, I'm Dr. Hans Toki, and this is another Social Insight. Today we're going to just have a little bit of a chat about the native peoples. I can't claim to be an expert on the native peoples, but I certainly have some passions about it. If we look at the chronology of native peoples in North America, they often are not viewed particularly as an important group. But indeed, the chronology of North America would show that the native people were here at least 1,500 years prior to any American showing up, perhaps more. So you have the natives, then you have the colonizers coming, then slavery, then Mexicans, later on the Noricans or undocumented, then the Asians come, and most recently the world comes to the United States. So the native population has been there far, far, far longer than anybody else has. But this is rarely appreciated. When I worked in the city of Vancouver, Canada, I had the privilege in the inner city with our children's program to be interacting regularly with Southeast Asian, predominantly Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Filipino, and native kids. Because the inner city did not have either black or Hispanic as you would have in a typical American inner city. So I had to become quite savvy about seeing the differences, the nuances between native peoples and Asians. I've done a test with my students over the years in New York City and Connecticut, and rarely can they tell the difference between a Southeast Asian, a native, a Cambodian, or a Vietnamese. I wonder if you could. Why is this? Because we don't encounter native people face to face in the Northeast, predominantly. But what's in the name? Is it an Indian? Is it a native Indian? Is it a Native American? Is it a native? Or is it a First Nations person? All of them have different connotations to them. But with it comes stereotypes. The stereotype typical of cowboys and Indians, the cowboys fighting the Indians and the clash between cowboys and Indians, and having cowboys and Indians parties. And then the stereotype of the savage. Is the native a savage fighter? This comes to obviously from the era when they were still predominant in North America. But then they fought hard to keep their freedom. Some prefer the reflective elder. Really, the worship and appreciation of the elder leader in Native culture is one to be honored and viewed as special. But for some, they would say, well, that's just the elders. So they are not truly civilized people. So the stereotypes persist. But of course, we have lots of team names with native tradition. The Indians, the Redskins, the Blackhawks, the Braves, and this year anyways, the Super Bowl winning Chiefs. So team names have either positive or negative connotations depending on who you are. I'm wondering if my team, the Seattle Seahawks, have actually a more pro-native approach in using native art actually as their logo, but not using actually a native name. But certainly the whole branding of the team aims around Northwest colors and the appreciation of native culture. Who is the savage though? At one point, the savage imagery to a European was an honorable one, because the natives fought for their freedom, and some advocated we should let them be free. But the tenacity of their fight was endearing. For others, this was the enemy, the savage to be defeated. The reflected elder, though, is often the preferred image, but not necessarily one who stands up for their rights and protests for their rights, but really who is calm, collected, and doesn't fight. What is a native girl? I think this is really interesting. Is it the image of a woman doing a dance with feathers and costume and working in substandard conditions to serve the owners? Or is it Shania Twain dancing around a stage, looking as if she might be just any old superstar? Both are native girls. So there's something about native assimilation that has taken place, where a lot of people don't notice native peoples because their collective voice has been reduced through a genocide that took place over several years. So they've essentially been obliterated as a voice in the eastern United States. And that's the home of politics, economics, and media. So being native isn't a thing that is viewed. Whereas in British Columbia, where I grew up, being native was a prideful thing, but also a oppressed thing. But I always appreciated native peoples. Thus the Seahawks perhaps reflect this mode where, yes, we might have used imagery of a native art, but we do it as appreciation. But policy decisions, if you were to study this, over the past 100 years, is about the continual reduction of native influence in the native voice and on American race and relations stage. So we don't talk about the native issues. So for instance, my colleague Dr. Cheryl Bear, a full-blood native in northern British Columbia, she has talked about civil rights and the American civil rights movement. And the argument she has made is the civil rights movement was never interested in including the native voice. Civil is about living in cities. So the civil rights movement was about access to city things, riding a bus, shared washrooms, schools, and so on. For a native, it's about land and sharing of land. And so the American discussion of race and ethnic relations has obliterated the native voice, even through its civil rights movement. I've challenged many black leaders over the years about this question: is why is the native voice never included? I said, well, they would say, well, they're more than open to be a part of our thing, but do you understand culturally and socially, they don't function in the same realm of the inner city as you do. Some hadn't thought about it that way before. So the question of genocide exists there. It's not a typical military genocide that we're used to, or a Holocaust from a war that we're used to. Really, it's the obliteration of the United States, of the native peoples. And so things such as disease, colonizers that were pre-constitutional, so there's no blame for taking the lives of Indians. Indians that are not wanting to be civilized and live by the laws of the land, the laws, of course, the ones written by the colonizers. So the killing of native peoples is more of a result of their own choice of not living by the law, not an actual war. And indeed, wars between tribes that had nothing to do with whites and blacks as they fought for their own survivals. Because native peoples weren't necessarily one grand racial group. There are a number of tribal groups fighting for survival. Alex de Tocqueville, in his great work, The Democracy in America, has a really gripping chapter called The Present and Probable Future Condition of the Three Races That Inhabit the Territory of the United States. Big, long title, I know. But he makes this key point. The one is that when he's observing in the early 1830s, he's seeing all three races, black, white, and savage. He uses it as an endearing term, living concurrently together. And in this one image, he sees a white little Creole child being cradled by its black nanny, and then a native woman comes out of the forest. And they're all there cuddling this white baby. The native woman turns and sees him in the distance and disappears into the forest. And from this, he illustrates of how he saw the future would be that the native savage would be free, but would be free and be pushed away and obliterated. But the black, the Negro, would become subservient. He predicted exactly what would take place years later. So what are some the methods of this? One of them is the obliteration of cultural and enculturation of Native children in a policy we call whiteization. And Native residential schools were set up. In Canada, there were church-run, government-funded residential schools for Native children. But this meant that you took children from the reserve, put them in these schools, boarding schools, away from their parents in order to whiteize them and allow them a good opportunity to make it better in white society. So the process of whiteization is cultural genocide. We won't kill you physically, but we'll kill the culture in order for you to be more successful. So the theoretical model behind the civilizing of Native children has brought an embarrassment, I suppose, in most recent years in how this has created ideas of reparations and trying to solve the Native situation. In Canada, has been instituted a forgiveness policy for these residential schools. Some success, I suppose, but can we ever get over such a tragic scenario? I'm not going to be the judge of that here today. An interesting little side bit to this for Americans is Pop Warner football. It began at the Carlisle Native Residential School, which a coach, Pop Warner, which is where you get the name Pop Warner football. Pop Warner football, for those who are not familiar, is youth football in the United States. And in order to play high school football, you usually have to play Pop Warner football, which is minor football. But it's interesting how this minor football is named after the coach at the Native Residential School in honor of this school because they invented the forward pass and how to run because they were not big like the college kids that they were playing. So interestingly enough, Native peoples, Native young men have had a significant influence in the development of American football. But land grants, reservations, the problem of water and of casinos are all parts we're working on these days. For instance, the problem of water. In the push west, in our modern era, Dr. Bear has argued for me that the toughest problem that exists on the Native Reserve is that there isn't fresh water. Why? Because many of the reserves were built adjacent to mines that had not survived. And so you have this situation where all the creeks and runoff is poisoned water, and there's no life to that. In her particular nation in northern British Columbia, the water and the river that runs through it is seen as the sustenance of the nation, not only for food and survival, but also for spiritual life. So water becomes very significant in Native culture, and the obliteration of fresh water has both a spiritual and a physical consequence that's tragic in many Native reserves. Well, we try our reparations, and one of them has been, in order to open a casino, you need to do it on a Native reserve. Now, some of these have been tremendously successful. I was at a conference at one in Phoenix, or already Scottsdale, and there was the huge development under Native land as an attempt at reparations, but it was a lovely place and brought lots of income to that particular tribe. Not farther north were very poverty-stricken tribes who had no tourists and had no business like this and had no water. And it was quite tragic driving up the highway and going into these little places to look at native crafts or whatever. And there the outhouse was full, the porta-john was full, and it hadn't been emptied for a while because it was too far to come up there from wherever they flushed them out, I guess, and there's no water around. So the difference in the life in that particular region becomes a problem of casinos giving lots of money, but other people don't survive well at all. But there has been attempts at forgiveness. Not a great amount of this in the United States, quite frankly, but certainly Canada has done some work. Too much complexity there to get in here to today, but I'd encourage you to look at the forgiveness policies in Canada to see what might work. But even more important, the rediscovering of ourselves idea among First Nations people, that we are somebody who not only can assimilate, but we can be extremely successful. A great example of this is Carey Price, the goaltender, all-star goaltender, I must say, world-class goaltender, I must elaborate even more, for the Montreal Canadiens. And how kept his native Anaheim Lake, British Columbia roots very alive in his discussions about himself, but has become a role model for many young men from the reserve. So we have the native questions, many, many more to be asked. But I think today we at least have a little bit more perspective about the native peoples. Have a great day. This has been A Social Insight.